The waiting had no beginning anymore. It was simply part of her days, like the ticking of the clock or the fading of afternoon light through the window. Every morning she would sit by that same window, hands folded on her lap, eyes fixed on the empty street outside. She used to count the days, Monday, Tuesday, Friday. Now time was a blur. Each sunrise promised a visit that never came. The phone had stopped ringing weeks ago. Her children had good reasons, she told herself. Work, families, busy lives. She didn't blame them. Not really. But still, she waited. Not out of expectation anymore, but because it was all she knew how to do. The house was quiet. Her tea cooled before she finished it. And as the sky turned gold each evening, she would whisper to herself, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow always looked like today. The phone was the only sound that used to make her heart leap. Every ring meant life on the other side of silence, a familiar voice, a reminder she was remembered. Now, it just sat there, still, unmoved. She would check the receiver sometimes, just to be sure it was working. It always was. It wasn't the phone that was broken. It was the connection, the fragile thread between her and the world that had quietly thinned. She kept it close, though, as if proximity could invite a call. Sometimes she would pick it up and dial one of her children's numbers, then stop before pressing the last digit. She didn't want to sound needy. She didn't want to interrupt. So she'd set it down again and whisper, "It's all right, Lord. I'll wait." And heaven, though silent, was listening, because God hears even the prayers we never finish speaking aloud. They meant well. She knew that. Her daughter had promised, "We'll come this weekend, Mom." Her son had said, "Next month for sure." But weekends turned into weeks, and weeks became seasons. The doorbell stayed silent. Sometimes she would set an extra plate on the table out of habit, then quietly put it away again. The loneliness didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, like dust settling on forgotten furniture. Still, she smiled when people called, if they called, telling them she was fine, that she had everything she needed. But when the phone clicked off, the truth returned. She had everything but someone, and even in that ache, she whispered softly, "Maybe they can't come, Lord, but could you stay?" That night, for the first time in months, she dreamt of light. The days no longer began with hope. She didn't rise early to watch the street anymore. The curtains stayed half-drawn, and the chair by the window stood empty. Waiting had turned from longing into fatigue, a slow exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She began to move slower, speak less, think less about what might be. Expectation had become a kind of pain. One morning, as she stirred her tea, she said quietly, "I think I've waited long enough." It wasn't bitterness. It was surrender. The gentle kind that comes when the heart has simply run out of strength. She no longer asked for visitors. She no longer checked the phone. She simply existed, quietly, patiently, almost invisible. But heaven, unseen, was already preparing a visitor. Not one she expected, but the one she had been waiting for all along. She had once been strong, the kind of woman who lifted furniture, carried groceries, cared for others without complaint. Now, even reaching for the cupboard made her tremble. Her hands ached when she tried to button her blouse. Her knees protested when she stood too long. The simplest things, pouring water, sweeping the floor, had become quiet victories. She didn't complain. Complaining never changed much. But there were moments, small ones, when she felt the sting of helplessness, like when she dropped a glass and couldn't bend to pick up the pieces, or when she watched the mailman pass her gate, letters in hand, but none for her. In those moments her heart whispered a single prayer, "Lord, I wish someone could help me." And somewhere unseen, that prayer became a ripple across heaven, because Jesus never overlooks the sighs of the weary. He counts them as invitations. She didn't know it yet, but her helplessness was the doorway through which help itself would come. It had been another long day, too quiet, too heavy, too much like the one before. The lights were off, the house still, the ticking clock keeping her company in the dark. She lay in bed, hands folded on her chest, eyes open to the ceiling, and finally the words slipped out, tired, fragile, half prayer, half confession. "Lord, if you're there, please see me. Just see me." She didn't ask for healing. She didn't ask for miracles, only to be seen, to be noticed by the one she still hoped hadn't forgotten her name. Her voice cracked and she felt the tears come, but she didn't try to stop them. When the last tear fell, she sighed and closed her eyes, not realizing that heaven had already heard, because God does not wait for perfect prayers, only honest ones. And that night, her honesty reached the heart of Jesus. Morning came, and with it, disappointment. Nothing had changed. No voice, no sign, no warmth in the air, just silence. She moved through her morning routine, her steps slow, her heart heavy. She began to wonder if perhaps heaven was as far away as everything else in her life. When she prayed again that afternoon, the words were barely a whisper. "Maybe you don't hear me anymore, Lord. Maybe I've become too small." She sat in her chair, the weight of silence pressing on her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she felt something like despair. But even silence can be holy. Even silence can be full of waiting. Because Jesus often arrives not after the silence, but within it. And though she could not yet see him, he was already standing in the quiet room, listening to the ache he was about to heal. It was the smallest of tears, barely formed, barely seen. It rolled down her cheek and caught the sunlight for an instant before disappearing into her hand. But in that moment, something invisible broke open. It wasn't the kind of prayer that could be spoken, but the kind that travels straight to the throne of God. Heaven paused. Angels leaned close. And Jesus, the one who sees every tear before it falls, was already moving toward her. She didn't feel it right away. The house still looked the same, the air still quiet, but there was a change, subtle, sacred. The silence had softened. The weight in the room had shifted. The same tear that had once felt like surrender had become an invitation, and that night, as the world outside slept, the one she had begged to see her was about to appear. It was late afternoon when it happened. The day had been grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. She had finished her tea and sat quietly, hands folded, eyes half closed. Then something changed. The air grew softer, warmer, still. It wasn't the sun. The light outside hadn't moved. It was something inside the room, inside her. A calm settled over her body, so deep and gentle she thought for a moment that she might be dreaming. She looked toward the door. It was closed. No footsteps, no sound. But she knew. Without seeing, without reason, she knew. Someone had entered, not a person, not a shadow, but a presence. Familiar, holy. And in that stillness her heart whispered before her mind could catch up. You came. It came like a breath, soft, steady, unmistakable. Not in the air, not from the walls, but from somewhere within her chest, as if her own heart had learned to speak in another's voice. I have been here all along. She froze. Her eyes widened, and tears rose before she could understand why. Every ache, every lonely morning, every prayer she thought had vanished. They all came rushing back, and now they had meaning. He hadn't left, not once. Her lips trembled. "Lord, is it you?" she whispered. And though the room remained silent, the peace that answered her was louder than any sound. In that moment, she didn't need to see him. She knew. Every day she had spent waiting, every sigh she had buried in the stillness. He had been there, watching, listening, waiting too, not for her to call louder, but for her to be still enough to hear. It was strange how suddenly lightness could return. Her body was still frail, her legs still unsteady, but something inside her had changed. There was warmth in her chest, a pulse she hadn't felt in years, the quiet rhythm of life waking again. She stood slowly, carefully, and walked to the window. The clouds outside had parted, letting a single beam of sunlight spill across the floor. Her reflection in the glass surprised her. The lines were still there, the grey hair, the wrinkles, but her eyes looked different, alive. She smiled softly. "Thank you," she whispered, not even sure what she was thanking him for, only that she could feel again, not just breath, but purpose. Waiting was no longer wait. It was invitation, because now she knew whom she was waiting with. That evening, she prepared for bed slowly, each movement deliberate, calm, peaceful. As she reached for her cane, she felt it again, that gentle warmth, as if someone's hand rested lightly over hers. Not heavy, not imagined, real. She paused, her breath caught halfway, and instead of fear, she smiled. "Thank you," she murmured. "I know it's you." Every step to her room felt lighter, steadier. The ache in her knees dulled, the weight of the day lifted. When she lay down, the silence was no longer empty. It was full, like a song too soft to hear, but too real to deny. And before sleep came, she whispered the words she hadn't said in months. "I'm not waiting alone anymore." The days that followed were quiet, but they no longer felt empty. The same walls that once echoed with loneliness now held a quiet peace that moved like light through every room. She still waited, for the phone to ring, for footsteps on the porch, for letters that rarely came. But the waiting had changed. She no longer watched the door with sadness. She no longer counted the days, because she wasn't waiting for anyone now. She was waiting with someone. Every hour, every breath became a conversation without words. She felt him there in the smallest things, in the breeze through the curtains, in the warmth of her cup of tea, in the peace that lingered even when nothing else happened. And she realized something sacred. She hadn't been waiting for help all these years. She had been waiting for presence. And now that he had appeared, the waiting itself had become holy. They started so quietly, she almost missed them at first. A knock at the door, the neighbor's child, bringing her flowers just because. A letter from her daughter, unexpected, full of warmth, a nurse from the clinic calling simply to ask, "How are you today?" Each moment was small, but to her, they were miracles. It wasn't the gestures themselves, it was what they carried. She could see his fingerprints on every kindness. One morning, sunlight broke through the curtains and painted her table in gold. She smiled, resting her hand on the open Bible before her, and said softly, "I see you in everything now." The miracles hadn't come from heaven as she once imagined. They had always been here. She just hadn't been still enough to notice them. Now, even the simplest day felt touched by eternity. Weeks later, the doorbell finally rang. Her son stood there, flowers in one hand, apology in his eyes. "Mum," he said softly, "I'm sorry it took me so long." But she only smiled, a calm, radiant smile that seemed to dissolve all guilt. "Don't worry, dear," she said. "Someone came before you did." They sat together for hours, laughing, remembering, talking about things that no longer hurt as much. Her children noticed something different about her. She looked the same, older, smaller, but her eyes carried peace, not resignation, but fullness. There was a presence in that house, subtle yet unmistakable, as though love itself had decided to stay. And though they didn't say it aloud, each one felt it. They hadn't come to bring her comfort. They had stepped into it. That evening after dinner, her daughter sat beside her and asked, "Mum, were you very lonely while we were away?" She paused, her wrinkled hands resting on the edge of her teacup. "I was," she said softly, "but only for a while." Her daughter frowned. "What changed?" She smiled, not in mystery but in tenderness. "One night, when I thought no one would come, he did." They didn't quite understand, but her voice was so sure, so serene, that no one doubted her. "Who, Mum?" her grandson whispered. She looked toward the window, where the evening light was fading into gold, and said, almost to herself, "Jesus. He came when I stopped expecting anyone else." The room grew quiet. No one spoke. But everyone felt something, a peace that filled the silence, like invisible arms wrapping around them all. After that night, her children began to visit more often. But even when they weren't there, her house never felt empty. There was something about the air, soft, still, alive. When guests came, they found themselves whispering without knowing why. It wasn't sadness that made them quiet. It was reverence. They said things like, "Your home feels peaceful," or "I can't explain it, but I feel calm when I'm here." She would simply smile and say, "It's because he's here too." It wasn't pride, it was certainty. She no longer needed proof, no longer needed sound or sight. The presence had become as real to her as breath itself, and that peace, born from waiting, refined through tears, woven by unseen hands, had now become her gift to others. The house that was once a place of loneliness had turned into a sanctuary, and in every corner Jesus lingered. The visits came and went, the voices, the laughter, the footsteps faded again. But she didn't mind. Her peace didn't depend on presence anymore. It depended on him. When the door closed, she would simply sit by the window, hands resting quietly, eyes lifted toward the horizon. Her faith no longer reached upward in desperation. It rested downward, deep into her heart, anchored in a presence that never moved. She didn't need signs. She didn't need to feel constant emotion. She simply knew. Sometimes she would say softly to herself, "I don't need to see him. He's seen me, and that's enough." It was the purest kind of faith, born not from answers, but from encounter, the kind that endures long after tears have dried. The years continued their quiet rhythm. Her steps grew slower, her hair turned silver, soft as snowfall, and though her body weakened, her spirit only grew lighter. She began to speak more often of heaven, not as escape, but as homecoming. "When he came before," she'd say, "he promised he'd come again." Sometimes she would dream of light, warm, gentle, like dawn breaking after the longest night. She would wake smiling, her heart whispering, "Soon." She no longer feared the unknown. The same voice that had once met her in her loneliness was now calling her forward, not to leave, but to arrive. And even as her strength faded, peace deepened, because she knew her waiting was almost over. It was a quiet morning, the light soft, the air still. Her breathing had slowed through the night, each breath gentler, each moment more peaceful. The nurse who checked on her said she was sleeping, but she wasn't sleeping. She was seeing. Her eyes fluttered open one last time, and her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The warmth returned, the same warmth that had filled her room years before. Only now it was brighter, nearer, complete, and there he was. The same presence that had once stood unseen in her solitude, now visible, radiant, reaching out his hand. "You waited well," he said softly. "I was with you the whole time." Her fingers moved slightly as though reaching to take his hand. And then she was gone, not into darkness, but into the embrace of the one who had never left. Her waiting had ended in arrival.